Hello, welcome to the IFSAM webinar. I'm Martin Spring, Vice President for Conferences. This is one of our occasional additional webinars on one of our soft policy themes, in this case, education. I'll just briefly introduce our panel for today. We have Lars Engvall from Uppsala University, where he is coordinator of the Higher Education Research and Culture in European Societies research area. You will notice that the panel has changed somewhat from what was advertised due to a couple of late changes, but we do have Flavio Macau, who's Associate Dean of Teaching and Learning at Edith Cowan University, representing an Australian perspective. And then our own Vanessa Bameo Pazmiño from Ecuador, who's also our Deputy VP Education, will and is Vice Rector for Education at UCACUE, Universidad Católica de Cuenca, in Ecuador. And finally, our own Sergio Wanderley, who is Vice President, IFSAM Vice President for Education, and is also going to provide a Brazilian perspective to the panel. So we're going to have contributions from each panelist and then some time for Q&A, we hope, at the end. I'll hand over now to Sergio to take it away.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you all for joining us today. Vanessa just got in. She was having problems in connecting. So first of all, thanks for the panelists who generously are here, Lars and Flavio. And the idea here is that as we have last minute cancellation, so I was announced as chair, so I'll then pass the chair to Vanessa Bermeo. She's working with us at IFSAM. I am the VP Education, and she's deputy together with Matteo Cristoforo, who's also here with us. So then I'll pass the chair to Vanessa. So she organizes the order of panelists, and then I go at the end as a panelist showing the Brazil view, as Martin has mentioned. And from there, Vanessa wraps up. Hopefully, she can also give us some view from Ecuador. And then we move to Q&A. So please, Vanessa, can you see if you have good connection now?
Yes, good morning. How are you? My name is Vanessa, as Sergio said. I had a problem with my connection, but I am here now. So I know I have to start. I am in Cuenca from Ecuador at the South America, and I am very, very happy to be here and to start this webinar about the governance of higher education markets in turbulent times, the challenge of corporatization and distance learning. So, Sergio, I don't know if we can start with the first panelist, Dr. Lars Engvall.
Yes, I think we're ready to start.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me for this, and I will take a bit broader perspective than just education, and we'll focus on the resource allocation in academic markets, because that is what is happening all over the place now, that we are expected to be competitive in a world market. So, and my point of departure is this triangle, is summarizing the system of resource allocation. It's based on a book by Burton Clark, It's now 40 years ago that it was published on the higher education system. And what he argues is that if we look at higher education systems in the world, there are three ideal types. Those who are mainly governed by the state, those mainly governed by the market, and those mainly governed by the academic oligarchy. In the state, they will give highly specified allocations. The market, they would mean market competition. And finally, with the academic oligarchy, it's a profession that allocate. Here we also have to put attention to academic leaders, who are playing a role, and I will come back to the extent they can play a role. So before we saw there has been a deregulation all over the place, and before this deregulation, the processes was that the professions, they told their leaders what kind of resources they wanted, and then the academic leaders went to the state with their wishes, and then something came back which was not necessarily what the academic leaders and the professions had asked for. And then that ended then with at the floor. Then in terms of research resources, and if we have seen the market allocation, the state has then to some extent provided block grants, which means that there is something for the academic leaders to distribute in the organization. But what we have seen to a very high extent is that we have turned the state had delegated to the market competition. So the academic oligarchy, they had to send project proposals to the market. And then there are other representatives of the academic oligarchy who are doing the peer reviews. And here metrics have played an important role. So that decision taken, and here we see the outcome is that the professions, they get their resources directly. But the state is not trusting the market completely. We see a lot of evaluations to see how do the institutions perform. What are the consequences then for university leaders? As you saw in the figure, that is a consequence is that they have a low control of the cash flow, since the resources go to individual researchers or research groups. And this would be sort of very astonishing to hear for a CEO for a company. They want to have control of the cash flow. What we see instead is that there is a pressure on them to expand their administration in order to promote the image of their institution or the media contacts. They help researchers to make applications, the grant office, and then to raise funds for their institutions, fundraisers. What are then the consequences for this, for resource allocation? Well, the proposal writing, the peer reviews, and the evaluations. Together, they will mean that we get considerable transaction costs in this system, which of course then leads to resource losses. And what about researchers then? Those are the faculty members who are applying. Well, we see a lot of short-termism, 2 short grant periods. You get a grant for 3 years, and there are not all scientific breakthroughs, if any, that will be done in 3 years, which is an ordinary term for research grants. There will be difficulties to fund new ideas. You know, the old guys are sitting there and saying that they want to have the usual stuff. and also that there will be a concentration to those who already have. I think a very important or worrying consequence here is that we have a discouragement from research careers, and that means also a discouragement from entering into academic institutions as academic teachers and so forth. So then coming then to the educational side, what can we see then in terms of the market allocation of students? Here we have gone from state allocation to a more market competition. This in turn has meant that academic leaders are trying to influence the market. So we see more and more activities of promotion of their institution, telling the audiences and particularly the students, the prospective students, how good it is to come to this specific institution. And here there are a number of things happening which are important. Accreditations that these academic leaders, they pay a lot of money for companies, organizations that provide these accreditation stamps, but also rankings. Rankings has become such an important variable in terms of academic governance. The result here is that from the market, the universities, the academic institutions, they get resources which can then be distributed in the organization. What about the consequences? Or there is also this, the evaluations. The evaluations are everywhere. What are then the consequences here for university leaders? Well, again, there is this strong focus on institutional reputation. And that means to a high extent, according to what we see from the research, that they'll be upgrading the ranking variables, things that can be measured and put into the rankings. And that has the consequence that teaching is to a certain extent or sometimes to a high extent downgraded, that faculty members are more appreciated for their publications in international journals than for what they do in the classroom. But it's an important difference here in relation to what I said about the allocation of research resources. Here, university leaders, they have control of the cash flow. And what does that mean? Well, we can expect them to be very keen on increasing the cash flow. And how do you increase the cash flow? That is something which will have consequences for students. The standards may decrease because if you are having too many failed students, you won't be paid. These are differences in different systems, but many systems give institutions their money both on the number of students they have and both on the examination. We can also see that there are tendencies to decrease the contact hours. Contact hours are very expensive. So if you can cut down there, you will be able to increase your cash flow. Same thing in terms of full-time faculty. There are tendencies these days that leaders try to cut down on the full-time faculty, will have more adjunct faculty and sort of adapt. It's kind of a gig economy. It's also something which we can expect to be even more prevalent in the future, that there will be a cut down on the premises. With the pandemic, we learned a lot that we can do things from a distance, and and it's also difficult nowadays to get faculty back to the premises. And what is then the link then to what you mentioned in the call, digital teaching. I would expect that we will see more of digital teaching, although there are also a number of problems with digital teaching. There are evidence that the dropout rates in this distant teaching is very high. So, and also what you're missing there is, of course, the interaction between students, and that the social interaction, which is so fundamental for their careers of teaching. And it could be mentioned here that when in some countries schools were closed down, when the students then could come, when they were sort of not going to the school, they were sort of longing to come back to the school, a school that they earlier didn't really praise. So in the risks I see here in a nutshell is that in terms of the market allocation of research resources, we see an increasing administration, the top administration. We see considerable transaction costs and a number of disadvantages for researchers. And in terms of market allocation for students, we can see that the striving for income may lead to quality decline. And on top of that, that cost cutting may lead to less faculty contacts. With that, I think, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, dear Dr. Lars Engel. We can hear about the system of resource, and we can see that there are three ideal types: a state with a highly specific allocations, the market with the market competition, and the academic oligarchy with the profession allocate. Also, we can see about the consequences of the university leaders, of the resource allocation, researchers, the research, the importation, the rankings. The rankings is very important, and the research will be upgraded by the rankings. Consequences also for the students about the standards, contact hours, full-time faculty and premises, and also the digital teachings. About the digital teachings, teaching is very important to say that we are missing the interaction between students, and that is fundamental. Thank you very much about the exposition of Dr. Lars Engel. And now we are very excited to see the presentation about the Dr. of Flavio Macau. Welcome, Dr. Flavio Romero from Macau, excuse me. We are excited to see your presentation and to learn about the higher education. Please.
Thank you so much for having me. So a brief introduction. My name is Flavio Macau. I've been in Australia for 5 years, a fantastic experience, which allowed me to kind of learn about something at some moments unexpected, at other moments some really interesting model of higher education, which is established this side of the world. And Australia, and when I talk Australia, you can to a large extent talk about New Zealand as well, because they are somewhat very similar in what they do. But focusing on Australia, Australia has a very limited number of universities. So there are 43 universities only in Australia, and that's it. If you compare with other countries that will have hundreds or even thousands of universities established, that's a very tiny number. And of those 43 universities, 37 are public universities. So there is not much space when you talk about the university at the university level of corporatization in principle. But then there is a different interpretation that I'll bring to that in a moment. So when you think about how the universities, those 37 public universities, how they are established and how they operate in Australia, to my surprise, more often than not, they operate like a business. So they do have KPIs, they do have targets, they talk about money, they talk about a return over investment and how much they will make at the end of the year. And it's a very professional management, more often than not. And if you are a corporation and you come and try to buy a chunk of a university in Australia, you will not be able to do that. You most probably be left out of the market because the barriers for entry are really substantial. If you open your lenses a bit from universities and you think about specific schools and other higher education services, like MBA courses, just as one example, or if you think about some pathway courses that will kind of provide an entry for international students to learn more about the country, learn English, and then sharpen their knowledge and skills before they move into university, then you'll find a broader market in Australia where you do have some of the largest corporations in the world buying some parts of businesses or even entering the businesses in full and then trying to make a good result from their operations in here. And that means that it's very competitive because you have so few players, and definitely what they are competing for is not only the domestic market, because the domestic market in Australia is not that large. We are talking about a country with 25 million people, but there is a really considerable international market coming to Australia every year. Just to give some perspective, we are talking about the exports from the education sector in Australia are around $30 billion per year, and it will be the fourth largest export. So it will be first mining, then oil and gas, then agribusiness, and then higher education. So it does make a lot of money to the country. And when you look at that, and to connect with the next topic in a moment, and you look into online is growing a lot, like 8.7% per year. But back to the idea of corporatization, that could be a problem if you're guided by KPIs like student satisfaction only or by student success rates, and we do see them all the day. But I had the experience to be part of a council in one of those institutions that do have half of it, it was bought by investors. And not only they are very conscious about keeping the quality at a high level, even if they try to, in a way, work more towards the KPIs and more towards the money rather than the quality, they would find a huge backlash coming from government, because in Australia the education system is highly regulated. You have TAXA, which allow those higher education courses to operate, and they keep a very close eye, and they do put institutions under the microscope. So even though there is this guidance toward those KPIs not necessarily will be those that maximize the money that you make only. Yes, you do have to make money. You do have to be sustainable as a business, but there will be a close inspection on what you are doing to guarantee student success, to guarantee that those students will receive a quality education. And you can say that if you go back 10 to 15 years, TEXA was more worried about compliance, to look how institutions were establishing their processes, be them private or public. And now their focus is more on the outcomes, the results. So they kind of take for granted that you have your processes established. And what they are looking for is how you're bringing continuous improvement. So again, if you go back 10 years in time, it was a free for all kind of Western, where everyone could make lots of money really quickly in the Australian market. And then this huge intervention came from the government, further regulating the system in such a way that you have a lot less freedom and a lot more focus on students. So that's something very interesting that does happen with Australia. And when you talk about a small chunk, not a small, a chunk of this market, which is the domestic students, because those domestic students more often than not will rely on grants given by the government to study in university or even in postgraduate courses. The government again has a huge impact on the flow of money, and I'll give you a few examples. The past administration put together a scheme where they wanted to prioritize STEM courses, STEM schools in universities, and they brought the price for those courses down with discounts that sometimes went as far as 80% discount for the student. And on the other hand, they brought the prices for those non-priorities up. So if you were to study, as an example, nursing, you would get a huge discount, maybe close to 70–80%. But if you would study geography, you would have to pay 2 times as much. They increase prices, not exactly prices, but they increase the amount of money they would give to universities for those students in those courses. They increase the amount of money given to nursing students and decrease the amount of money given to geography students, as an example, making the course more expensive to students. So another thing that they do with those domestic students, now there is a limit on the amount of money that a student can spend in their degree. So most degree students will have access to $110,000 in grants as a top limit for an undergraduate degree, and they can't spend more than that. And you only get that money, that grant renewed, if you pass over 50% of your credits. That's a new legislation that came recently, which is a way to kind of curb those students that would go from a course to the next, failing, and increasing their debt without getting an outcome, without getting a result. So in a nutshell, what you can see in terms of corporatization in Australia is that it's not as huge as what you can see in other countries. And when you do see that happening, what you see happening actually is that even those that are non-corporations do have KPIs, such as income, such as the financial results as central to their strategies, but well balanced with checks and balances that also bring quality and put the students central in this conversation as a priority. So that is part of the conversation that we can have today. And then when we move to the discussion about distance learning and what's happening in Australia, it's not that much different from what other countries did experience, especially with COVID and with this sudden move that most people had to make in a short time to online learning. And now how do you go back to the face-to-face situation? So there's a lot of discussion going on. One of the main discussions that we have at the moment is about hybrid learning. So what is our perspective into hybrid learning? And there is a big divide in Australia. Some universities go to this interpretation that hybrid learning is offering both online and face-to-face options at every time, and then it is up to the student to make a choice. So today I'm feeling like I want to go to the uni and watch my class in week 3, which will be a good one, and then I go there face-to-face. Then next week I'm not feeling that in the mood to go to uni, and instead of going to class, I will watch the class from home, from my sofa, and that's it. I have full choice in this hybrid learning mode. That is the interpretation coming from some of the institutions. Other institutions, they do go into hybrid mode, but they don't give students the choice. So what they have is a plan that says weeks 1, 2, and 3, we do have face-to-face only, and we have good reason for that. It is part of the strategy for this course, this unit that we are delivering to you. And then on week 4 and 5, the topics are topics that we can easily discuss online. So no face-to-face, go to online only. Then week 6 and 7, face-to-face again. Maybe week 8, it's a site visit that we discuss in week 9 online. So there is a mix of activities, both on campus and online, but it's not up to the student to make a choice. They are predetermined by the unit coordinator. Going back to my first example where students have the choice, I did try that in a course about a year ago. And what I found out is that when you give students the option, engagement goes down really quickly, because quickly what you have is that most students will move to online, and you don't have critical mass face-to-face to conduct a good experience. So I kind of went to the extremes and to that other model, the second model that I mentioned. When I want them online, I want them all online if I can. When I want them face-to-face, I want them all face-to-face if I can. So that's a discussion that is going on about what hybrid learning is and what is our intent and what are the effects on pedagogy when you discuss hybrid learning. Another discussion that is coming nowadays really strong, and you have been there when you talk about distance learning, is so what do you do with the generative AI? So how do you assess students who are studying online with generative AI, given that nowadays they can do reports, essays, online tests, or whatever you think, they can get support from generative AI. And it is not science fiction. In not a distant future, even if you talk about vivas, so some kind of assessment that is done face-to-face, you'll be able to do that real time with generative AI. You may have seen on the web that you can record videos using generative AI that are pretty convincing. And so all these things kind of pose a challenge to how you will address your assessments and your assignments to measure student learning in this new area of generative AI and other types of AI. So what's happening in Australia is a profound discussion in the sector that has just started about, okay, so the more traditional ways of assessing students, they are really fragile and susceptible to be, to be in an unethical way be dealt with through generative AI. So where do we go from here? How do we address student learning? How we can measure that with new tools, new experiences? So what do? We do intensify and have some really deep assessments. But if we do that, can we do that at every point, 3 times in a course, 3 times in a unit, as we call it here? There's not enough resource to do that. So how do we balance the amount that we assess those students with the resource that we have, and knowing that this generative AI discussion will get only more and more complex and elaborated if we are kind of mesmerized with what those programs like ChatGPT do now? Imagine 2 years from now, because this is evolving really quickly. So that is part of this discussion about how distance learning is going. One thing that we find sometimes hard to cope is the expectation that students have with this online and distance learning, because they want distance learning at any time. They want everything at anytime and every time. So they have this expectation when we do have a schedule a session, when we expect them to come together for 1 hour, let's say on a Wednesday late afternoon, to discuss the questions that they might have about an assessment. They want to have that at their convenience, at the time of their choosing. So they kind of do not like that the model, that is the model that we can do with the resource that we have, where you have a lecturer addressing an online class for 1 hour on a Wednesday from 6 to 7 p.m. They want to have that lecture accessible individually for them on a Saturday at 3 p.m. And they do complain when they don't get that. And they do say, oh, I'm paying good money for you for this online education. And I do expect you to record all classes and to teach me real time at the time of my choice, not at the time of your choice. And then it does bring some tension. So that's why we say we can rely to students at satisfaction to some extent, because this will be a very dissatisfied student, which will bring the KPIs down. But we have in a way to not take it into full strength when we do our analysis, or else we will kill the poor lecturer because we don't have the resources to do everything at any time for students. And just to close my my perception of what's going on in Australia, when you talk about distance learning, what is new around here, new in a way, but is gaining momentum in Australia, is not that universities are offering more courses or new courses by themselves. You do have some corporations joining the market, establishing partnerships with universities to market and offer those courses online. So say that I have 30 courses that I do offer in my campus, both online and face-to-face. So these corporations come to me and say, hey, Flavio, we do think that those 2 courses that you have there really have a lot of potential to go beyond what you can offer to your cohort in your state or region, and we want to offer them nationally. And what we will do, we will repackage that course. We will improve the connectivity, and we'll add some tools that will make this course more engaging online. We'll manage those students. They will still be your students, but we'll help you manage them, and we'll massively advertise that, and then we split the money. You get some money, I get some money, I take some of the effort from you, I add value. So instead of you having your lecturers who are not learning designers by nature preparing those online courses, I have my learning designers who will talk to your lecturers and provide a really spectacular online experience to students. So you do see those companies growing their market in Australia. And then there is this tension in universities about, so what do I do? Do I keep that course with, I don't know, 50 students enrolled, and I'm happy with that, with the money that I make? Or do I open that course to this corporation who will advertise this course and maybe give me only half of the money, but instead of 50 students, now I have 150 students. So these are the kinds of tensions that we see in the market now. And on that, I will pause my explanation at this time, and then happy to go back to it and answer any other questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Flavio Macao. I think that is very interesting to know about Australia. No, Australia, as you say, has a very limited number of universities, 43, and the public university about 37. The discussions that you say is about the hybrid education and the impact of the education, no? I think that is very interesting about the way that the university in Australia has development. And at the end of the presentation, for the final presentation, I would like to make a very fast that we are happening in Ecuador. So I think that we are common points, and other is not very attractive points if we have to compare with Australia. Thank you very much for your presentation. We can see about the perception that is happening in Australia, establishing partnership with the university, and the importance of the hybrid education and the distance education, and other questions that we can see. Now I have the presentation of Dr. Flavio, now we have the presentation of Dr. Sergio Wanderley. Welcome, Sergio, and we are excited to listen your presentation.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. So brief introduction, I'm VP Education at IFSAM, and I'm sitting in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. One day from winter, and we have 25 sunny day outside, 25 Celsius degrees. So that's what we're expecting from winter around here. So I'm gonna put some big numbers from Brazil, and of course, indeed, they are big numbers. Anything in what concerns higher education in Brazil is big, but it's more numbers, and then an overview, and then close with OECD figures for higher education on the countries, on private, public, just to really open up for debate. So let's start with the sheer size of the Brazilian market, just for you to have an overview. So this is the size of the Brazilian higher education market. So the last figures we have available from the closing of 21, they were released November 22 by the Education Ministry. The body doing that is on the source there, ENEP. It is also, like Australia, it's a very regulated market, and also a very good provider of statistics, official statistics. So from what you see, close to 9 million enrollments, and close to 7 million in the private sector. Public, just over 2 million. So that means it's 77% of the market is private. And the number of institutions is huge. Over 2,000 higher education institutions, private, and 313 public. And then the students that have started their course in 2021, close to 4 million. And those concluding 1.3 million. So just to give you big pictures. And on the bottom, you see the growth on total enrollments since 2011. So from 6.7 million to 9 million students. If we go 30 years, basically the market has been multiplied by 6. So from 1.5 million students in the early 90s to 9 million students now. So it's really a big success in inclusion of students, but still Brazil is behind in what concerns the inclusion of 18, 24-year-old. Still very low percentage comparing to OECD countries. So the effort has paid for, but there's still a long way to go. So, distance learning. From what you see from the green bar, the initiating since 2011 has grown from 400,000 to 2.5 million students. in 2021. So a six-fold increase in number of students making the options for distance learning education. So I have marked there 2020. It was the first year that for the first time number of students opting for distance learning was higher than in class. And then of course, 2021, this gap was much larger. So basically now, after all this very steep growth, distance learning accounts for 41% of total enrollments as in the market as a whole, but in the private segment is already over 50%. And if we keep this path of 70% entry from 2021, soon distance learning is gonna make in-class looks very small. So that's where we are moving in distance learning. And same as in Australia, there is kind of a speed of growth that has not been followed up by good controls by the government. So it's really a caution there. And on corporatization, so I made this list of the top 10 private higher education institutions in Brazil. Out of the top 10, 7 of them are listed companies. So if you mean corporatization, that's what it means. So certainly this will rank among the largest institutions in the world. Croton, number 1, already has scored over 1 million students. So basically these institutions, they are an umbrella and they have many small HEIs across the country, but they have this configuration. Everything is consolidated in the parent company. So really talking about corporate world. So 5 of the top 10 are listed in the Brazilian stock market, B3, that's the Brazilian stock market, and 2 of them are listed at NASDAQ because they consider themselves edtechs. That's the new thing in town. So basically Vitro, number 2, the last one to open capital in November 21, it's 98% distance learning students all across the country, but only in Brazil. They have shares at NASDAQ, but they are a private institution in Brazil. And only 3 are still private owned companies, not opened, but I'm afraid soon they're gonna be swallowed if they don't go listing. Uninter, Unipe, and Uninove. So this is the configuration of the top 10. As you can see, they have in total 4.3 million students, meaning that the balance of 2.6 million students in the private segment are in over 2,000 institutions, higher education institutions. So if the top 10 has an average of 432,000 students, the other small institutions will have just over 1,000 students. So how is competition gonna go forward for this one? During the pandemic, of course, the small ones became even weaker, and this top 10 list has been got even bigger and smaller. So top 10 has 62.5% market share of the private market in Brazil. So they are very strong actors. And who are the actors behind this, the top 10. So here I give you the list of the private equity financial investors that are behind these institutions. So this classification I put there in the second column, full corporation, both Croton and Edux, they consider themselves, if you go in the investor relation website, they consider themselves full corporations, meaning that there are no shareholders, block of control shareholders defined. So they are free floating companies, most of it. But as you see in the number one, BlackRock has been increasing their position there. BlackRock has now over 10%. So BlackRock happens to be world's largest private equity fund with circa $10 trillion under control and investing all across the globe. So then you can guess how important this market actor is. But there was a relevant fact released by Croton saying that BlackRock is increasing its share position, but has stated that it's only doing this for financial purposes with no intention to enter management. So you see a full list there of global private equity funds, some local private equity funds, and what I call hybrid is exactly the combination of private equity funds with actual founders, Brazilian educators, founders of this higher education that are still there somehow playing an important role. And this is just food for thought for further discussion on OECD Education at a Glance report released last year. So there you can see the share of students in private HEIs in the world, in OECD countries, but across the world. So basically OECD average is just below 30%, which is just above the US, which is less than OECD countries. But on this report, OECD made a statement that even in Europe, the average is below 30%. Most of the countries are between 10 and 30%, but you have very varying degrees of private segment from the UK, which is 100%, up to Luxembourg, which is 0 on the extremes of this graphic. And that's where I'm trying to dwell in my research. Brazil, as you can see, is among the top 7. And we are in good company of Japan and Korea. So I'd like to learn a lot from Japan and Korea to promote the governance of a local market, because I believe what we need now is what Flavio just described, a shock intervention by the government in a moment that anybody could make any money. And I also have checked the EBITDA indicator for these 7 corporations, and they are on average about 30%. So that's why private investors are coming to Brazilian higher education market, because it's a marvelous return on investment. So they are coming, and we certainly need a shock intervention by the government, also in what concern distance learning, assurance of learning, because it's completely out of control according to the last research I could check. So that is where I'd like to stop and let you, Vanessa, to wrap up, and then we may open for Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sergio Wanderley. We can see the top 10 of the higher education institution and also the strong actors that are behind this. also about the OECD countries. That is very interesting. In this point, I would like to talk about what is happening in Ecuador briefly. After the approval of the higher education law in Ecuador in last October 2010, a process of accreditation and categorization of higher education institutions in the country began, which ended approximately in 2014. This process had three fundamental pillars: guarantee the quality of higher education, seek the consolidation of postgraduate process, and seek the public resources for research are channeled to the best institution valued and the best scored that visualize real and adequate research processes. With this process, some universities in our country were not accredited, so they had to close. Others began improvement process, and others were placed in categories A and B. There were A, B, C, and D categories with the letters, and A and B were the best evaluated. Currently, this classification scale doesn't exist. It simply indicates that they are accredited, not accredited, or in the process of accredited. After pandemic, also distance learning and hybrid learning increased. The challenge now in our country is to ensure that these learning modalities are effective. That is a brief lecture about that we are happening now in Ecuador and specific in Cuenca. That is all, Dr. Sergio. I don't know if we can open a space for discussion or any question that you can have.
Yes, I think we can open now for Q&A. Juliana, you agree?
Yes, I think so. I think Mateo has raised his hand. So please, Mateo.
Yes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can,
Yes.
Mateo.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for your great presentation, first of all. I was wondering if the phenomenon of corporatization is, according to you, somehow linked to distance learning and hybrid learning. I mean, are those two phenomena correlated somehow, and one is causative of the other, or not? What is your impression from your country, from your context?
Okay, if we don't have any specific order to address the question, we just jump in and talk a little bit about that. What I think is happening is that you do have a massification of education going on globally. As per the data that was brought by Sergio, that happened not only in Brazil, but in many other countries. If you look at the numbers in Australia, you will find that a considerable chunk of the market comes from international students that are coming from countries like India and Pakistan. So where there is this massification of education, this large group of new people entering the market, there is a market opportunity. So that's where those corporations are developing across the world. They do see this market opportunity. And then when you have a change in how things take place, that means risk. And that risk is an even greater opportunity for corporations to take hold and make more money of those risky situations. So online study, distance learning, we did have that happening in the past few years, but it did go through a boom with COVID. And that kind of shook a little bit the structures that we had all over the place, which again is another opportunity for those corporations to jump into that and take that risk, because typically those non-corporate institutions doesn't have the same appetite for risk that corporations do. And that's why they do take advantage of distance learning as a way to expand their businesses, inject some capital, change things a bit, offer a better structure and hardware, maybe a little bit of software as well, and then make money from that. So I do see that distance learning was kind of the perfect opportunity for those corporations to jump in.
Can I add there, this distance learning, in principle, it sounds really very logic that you take on your studies on the internet, but I think we also should consider that universities have a very significant role with their examination. And this is the relation to the labor market. So it's much more impressive when you go to the labor market if you have a degree from Harvard or some other top institutions than if you come with some kind of certificate from your distance learning. And when I talk, I have a related question to both Brazil and Australia. When you're talking about these institutions, is there some kind of hierarchy between these institutions? That some institutions are better than others. This is the sort of the mechanism of sorting people. Those who are making careers in your countries, do they come from some elite institutions, or is there, doesn't matter which kind of institution you have graduated from?
May I jump in now? Thank you, Lars. So I'll first reply to Matteo, and then I go to Lars' question. So Matteo, I will reply to you with the indicator investors like the most, EBITDA. In Portuguese, we always make another word of an acronym. We say EBITDA. So 47% is the EBITDA for distance learning announced by Edux, the number 3, with close to 800,000 students. 47% for distance learning compared to 29% of in-class. So which one you like better? So that's why they are moving, the corporations, they are moving more to distance learning and giving up the returns on in-class, even though they are still 29%. But the corporatization in Brazil has started earlier in the present century, before distance learning got this boom. So corporatization, what I say is that in Brazil, corporatization has started 2005 with first international investment by Laureate Group, US group in Brazil. And then 2007, we had the first IPO of Anhanguera, which was bought later by Croton. So corporatization was going on before distance learning, but yes, distance learning has increased quickly the corporatization in the market. And then back to Lars, yes, there is a group of elite universities that are forming our business elite in the country, and they are what we call here in between two worlds. So the top 10 we just saw they are mass education. And the other side, we have the public sector. Best grades, and again, it's regulated by the Education Ministry, which is grading every 3 years, all the 2,000, close to 3,000 institutions, let's call it. Every 3 years, they regrade them. So there are grades that you must abide to. So best grades are on the public segment and on the private not-for-profit segment. That's where we have the elite schools. On the top public and on the profit, not-for-profit private segment, mainly universities that are held by foundations and confessional, like the Catholic universities that we have 5 big ones across the country, and it's difficult to access their figures, but I could get their turnover. So by their turnover, they would be top 5, the Catholic. So they are also an important group of, there is an important group of elite universities sitting on the private not-for-profit segment.
And jumping in.
Sorry, I was just going to invite you in, Greg, sorry.
Oh, thank you. I'm Greg Bamber, Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. And thank you very much for a really worthwhile and interesting and important discussion. My question, I started to type it in, and then I'm sorry, I'm working on a little laptop, which is not very user-friendly, trying to type in and look at the screen at the same time. And I'm guessing most of us on the screen in this discussion are academics. And one of the consequences of the marketization of higher education that has been described by Lars and others has also been the commodification of the work of academics. University top administrators and deans now see academics as simply substitutable. If I leave my institution or you leave yours, then they can just slot someone else in to cover our work and use our PowerPoint and so on, as if there was really no difference between us. And I wonder if there's a role for IFSAM here in trying to develop some policy that our member associations and academies might pick up and try and run with, because it really disturbs me that we're seeing a move into our field of big private equity funds, as Sergio has described, and also the move of some of our programs, as Flavio has described in Australia, a program I used to run at Monash University, for example, a specialist master's program was suddenly stopped with no real explanation. And then I noticed a year or so later, this same program was being offered online by Seek, who are a big commercial labour hire job placement agency that's decided in Australia and some other countries. It's decided that there's a good return on investment in higher education, so it would move into that area. And rather than specialists, I think Flavio mentioned that an argument could be that specialists in distance learning or teaching might take over running some of our programs. The reality is it's simply part-time sessional people who may or may not be qualified. They may or may not be moonlighting from other universities who are doing it. They're not really specialist people who are doing research and trying to advance scholarship in the field. They're simply putting a package together to try and sell. So I'm very disturbed about many of these trends, and what can be done about it, and what role can IFSAM play? That's my point on the table, please.
May I come in and comment on that? I think it's a basic question here. What is a university? And, if we have all these numbers, as I indicated already, I think there are large differences between them. And you can even question that some of these commercial activities, are they really universities? As you point out, that we define universities as a place where you both teach and do research. And my guess is that the research content of some of these companies is not that very heavy. At the same time that they are on the market, I noted from this list, I think it was, with Brazil, that one of them was owned to a very high extent of Bertelsmann, which is a big publisher in Europe. So here you have this relationship between media and education, which is really something different from us. But at the same time, I think we should also think about what is happening in terms of new knowledge, particularly in this area of development of information technology. It may be so that these business type organizations, they be able to move faster, to adapt new things, which is not then adapted at the university, because universities, they are by tradition a bit conservative. They should be conservative, be critical and so forth. But in a very dynamic world where perhaps the exam is not so important any longer, it's that you have this specific knowledge in terms of information technology. I think that's a real threat, more than that they outcompete us for the traditional education.
I agree, Lars. Thank you for your comments, which are very profound and well informed. Thank you.
May I, Juliana?
Yes,
Like,
yeah. Yes, and
like,
then Martin also had a comment after.
Lars, like we say in the legal procedure, the part that has been mentioned has the right to reply, because you mentioned Bertelsmann.
Yeah,
so right. Bertelsmann is actually the owner of the university where I sit here in Rio de Janeiro.
Okay.
And I'll give my personal example as what is going on in Brazil. So I've been there now in the University Unigran Rio for 7 years. And when I joined 2016, it was a 50-year-old university, family owned.
Okay.
By the founder family Erdi, and our Dan was one of the sons of the founder for over 30 years, so very traditional. So then 2020, beginning of pandemic, they were acquired by AFIA, one of the top 10, which was NASDAQ already. And NASDAQ was also family funded, but in partnership with a private equity fund in equal size. So I then changed it from family to NASDAQ, private equity. And then just a few months later, I became owned by a German publisher, as you mentioned. And then I realized what is Bertelsmann doing in education? So then I started to research. So a few years ago, they started in the USA, investing in education. So it's a new arm for Bertelsmann, a new business arm for Bertelsmann as education. So, and now they bought the full share of the private equity. That's what private equities are there for, right? They go in, buy a chunk, make the share price go up, and then they sell and go out, flip and go, right? So Bertelsmann came in at that time. Of course, I hope with a longer time view, they will become 200 years old very soon, in 2 years. So, and then they bought the control from the owner family, who is still there, but now Bertelsmann has the biggest share. So this is what is going on here.
This is very interesting because, as you know, the history of Bertelsmann, that is acquisitions in the media. The whole media business has been sort of filled with acquisitions, and Bertelsmann is one of the big companies acquiring, and it's very reasonable that they go into also education, because you know they publish all kinds of educational material and so forth. So I think we should see more of we'll see more of that. So very interesting that you're bringing up this.
Thank you, Sergio. Martin, your question, please.
Thank you, Juliana. Yeah, perhaps a bit linked to Greg's point about what IFSAM can do, particularly Sergio and Flavio. The data that you presented and the picture that you painted is often about the university as a whole, but I think in the UK, it's typical that we're typical at Lancaster that we kind of subsidise the rest of the university from the management school, particularly postgraduate taught programs, where we have discretion on pricing. So I wonder if you could comment on the particular effects of or role in this process that you've outlined of marketization and so forth of the business and management sector within the university sector.
Okay, if I can jump in a bit, that's true in Australia as well. Most of the time, the business school is the cash cow, and then the money goes to a central structure that ends up buying the equipment and investment that helps other courses that are not as profitable as business schools. Something interesting that is happening is that thankfully this responsibility is kind of becoming more distributed recently, because there is a lot of opportunity happening in the market in courses that have a little bit of business in it, but actually are more related, as an example, to health management. So one course that recently exploded in our university is business psychology, healthcare management. So you do have those other courses sharing the load with what in the past was purely business. And why I'm bringing this up, because this explosion in a way is mediated by these corporations. So by ourselves, our courses, our programs were kind of limited to the cohorts that we could reach in our state, in our region. And every now and then you would get the occasional student coming from another state or even from another country to that specific course. And then when we started those partnerships with some of those private corporations that repackage the knowledge that we have, and they started to build this new online accelerated offering and to promote it to other markets domestically. And now they are starting to promote to other markets, in our case, to Asia Pacific. You do see a huge influx of students, and as a result, a huge influx of money that will end up subsidizing other parts of the university. And why is that? At least in Australia, you can say that the investment coming directly from government in research has been declining over the past few decades. And then universities do have to find a way to fund their research, or they are left behind. So this is the solution that universities kind of found around here, which is to join forces with some of those private institutions to potentialize their knowledge, their courses, and make a little bit more money out of it. If it is right or wrong, if we should continue by ourselves, or if it is okay to join those corporations, it's open to discussion because it's a kind of a recent phenomenon. But it is fit to the purpose, I must say. It does help with cash flow. It does have an impact. It does increase the quality of our online offerings. I must say that not every one of my research teaching academics is as technologically savvy as one of those learning advisors from those companies that are repackaging the information. So I try to see those things from half full glass perspective. I'm optimistic that there is space for all these partnerships to come together, and those corporations are in a way helping universities become up to date with technology. And then, of course, there is a bigger discussion, which was raised by Greg, I believe, which is about, so what's the role of the academic in this process? What's the role of the teaching and learning, the research and teaching academic, and what universities should do? If you think about the commoditization of the lecture, you can think that if it kind of became a commodity where anyone can teach, then generative AI will be able to teach in 2 or 3 years' time. So what is the new position that universities will take in this new reality? And inside the universities, what is the role that will be left for academics to play? And inside this role, where IFSAM wants to guide that discussion and how it will position itself? Those are some really interesting questions that most definitely would lead to another webinar and another debate of hours and hours and hours.
Thank you, Flavio. I believe Lars has also a comment. Can I just add a comment to what Flavio just mentioned? Here in Brazil, also if you look from the market perspective, especially for executive courses, companies and their employees are actually looking for courses offered by these institutions. They are preferring these type of courses than the ones traditionally offered by universities and so on. So I think there's the technological aspect, but also the market perspective. The demand is calling for these types of courses, and perhaps because they see more added value related to technology. So I was wondering, Lars, if you could add that point as well to your comment.
My comment was in relation to this statement which you hear over and over again, that business schools are cash cows for the universities. But at the same time, you should remember that it's good for the business schools to be in a university. They take advantage of the brand. The best example here, I think, is Said Business School. Starting a new business school is very difficult, but Said was started within Oxford University, and just the brand Oxford University meant it skyrocketed in the rankings. So there is some sort of symbiosis here between some benefits for the business schools to be in a university. And your comment was in relation to what the others can offer. I think that was related to my earlier comment that universities may be much slower than these commercial organizations. Was that what you said, or what?
Yeah, I think so. I think from a market perspective, at least here in Brazil, companies and employees are looking for these courses that are offered by companies, not only universities as well. So that is...
but there they have a niche, but at the same time we come back then to what is really university, and also the role that research should play in academic institutions, and there are discussions in all countries how much money resources you should put into research, and in order to be world class, and that's the way we are supposed to gaining the competition between countries. Before Ukraine, this research policy was kind of a defense policy, but now all countries are moving more into the traditional defense policy.
So we have 4 minutes left. Perhaps we have time for this last question. Glenn, please.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this discussion. My question goes to Professor Lars Engels, whose presentation I really enjoyed among all the others. Clearly this evening we have to think a little bit about governance in the face of the various trends that we see emerging, corporatization, the artificial intelligence or generative artificial intelligence, and also I would say to a very great extent the ChatGPT, which is the most latest or most recent application towards whatever academe does. I wonder what would be structures of governance beyond those that exist right now, and is IFSAM thinking in those lines to come up with a voice of ethics, a voice of due discretion, a voice of fair participation in HEI? Thank you.
If I may answer, I think you have really an important point here, and what you are indicating, and also in some of the early interventions, is a role of the profession. It's a profession that has to be a counter force against too much commercialization, too much intervention from the states in terms of how we should teach and what we should teach, etc., etc. And the whole question about academic freedom is so important these days. And then you mentioned ChatGPT, and that's interesting. You may think that the ChatGPT that will make universities or academic institutions to think that they need to have direct contact with the students even more, because if you have them way back and they can send in whatever they produce and for their examination, that's really a problem. I suppose you all have tried this ChatGPT, and it's amazing. I had a conference 2 weeks ago, and I asked it to also on the publishing in academia, and I asked for an introductory remark, and it was fine. so there are threats here but my main message here is a responsibility of the profession. We cannot lean back. We have to fight back.
I guess we have reached our time. I'll pass on then to Sergio after thanking all the panelists. And Sergio, if you want to say your final words.
Just to corroborate with Lars, we should not let the algorithm teach. So I believe we as academics may be the last barrier between this full wave. Embrace and move forward, but without leaning, as Lars said. Flavio, would still like to say a few words before we close?
Just to thank you for the opportunity to discuss this today. We could go on and on and on, especially if we move into the role of artificial intelligence and generative AI, but I'll leave that to another happy day.
And I'm sure gonna take to IFSAM BOD the comments here from Greg, from Lars, from Glenn, that we should look for a role. And tomorrow we have the General Assembly. We're gonna be discussing the soft policies we have developed, and there is one in education. Of course, it's heavily on ethics. And I think what you're telling us, this is certainly a way to go. Martin, would you like to jump in to close down?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I was even wondering whether we need another soft policy dimension, which is more of governance and business school policy as such, kind of a thread. Yes, thanks very much. Just to round off, thank you again to the speakers, Lars, Flavio, and Sergio. I think it turned out to be a fascinating conversation. Thanks to Vanessa for chairing and keeping people on time and framing the questions. Juliana for helping set the thing up and handling the Q&A. And Eleonora back in the background on organising the platform. And I'll say thank you again to Sergio for conceptualising the thing. And it proved to be, I think, a compelling and very fitting topic for our webinar. And thanks to everyone for attending.
Well, thank you all very much for it. And will the recording be made available on the IFSAM website, I wonder, in due course? Mm-hmm.
Yes, it will. And I think with speakers' permission, selected slides that they've used today as well.
Great. Thank you. Good on you.
Plenty to think about, which is the way we like it.
Indeed. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
to all the speakers
Bye-bye.
and panelists. Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Bye.